So, hello everyone. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague from Strong Towns Langley, Mike Parker, and we both have the pleasure of talking to Reece Martin, known for his popular YouTube channel RMTransit, which covers transit systems here in Canada and around the world. He's written articles, he's been featured in independent CBC videos, and most importantly, from what I understand, you grew up right here in Langley. So let's start with that. What was it like growing up? All right.
Yeah. I think Langley was an okay place to grow up in. Obviously, Canada is generally a pretty hospitable country, and Langley was not the worst place to be. But it wasn't necessarily the most walkable or easily navigable place. Though at the same time, I did cycle around a lot into my teens, and I did walk a lot, but it was just a lot of very long walks. So yeah, it wasn't a terrible place. I certainly wish it was more urban, though.
Yeah. What neighborhood, what area did you grow up in, if you don't mind me asking?
I grew up in Brookswood, but I spent a lot of time in other parts of Langley. So I had my grandparents lived in Murrayville, and I was often in Walnut Grove to go to the pool there, and so I was kind of all over the place in Langley, as one does when you're living in a place.
Well, it's great you're able to get around. UT Lee, he also grew up in Langley and Walnut Grove. So we have a bit of a sort of school of urbanists coming out of Langley, which I always think is really cool. Um, Obviously now you live in Toronto, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And so what kind of prompted that decision? Like, what do you love about living there, and what made you choose that
Well,
place?
when university came along, the program I wanted to study at was at the University of Toronto. I mean, Langley does not have any really, serious research universities, so it was like that or like UBC or something like that. And Toronto was building a lot more public transport at the time, was more affordable than Vancouver. Um, was just seemed like a more dynamic and interesting place to be. And I'd grown up in Metro Vancouver, and so yeah, I decided to move to Toronto.
Oh, um, yeah. I mean, I think that's just something I've observed about your YouTube channel is like you tend to look at all different countries, different cities around the world, and I'm always interested what kind of motivated that idea to just kind of. It's almost like I mean, this is the impression I get. Is you're kind of trying to bring it here, almost to educate maybe people in Canada about these systems, or what is the backstory behind that?
Well, I think it's a sort of globalist viewpoint. I think that it's really good for people to be familiar with what goes on in other countries, and to realize that there's a lot of stuff in common, and a lot of the same problems and solutions exist in other places. And so I think that part of it is just kind of a belief that people should be familiar with the stuff that's over yonder. Sometimes that's not even very far away. A lot of people in Toronto that I meet over the years, have never been to Montreal, right? It would be like someone in Vancouver who never visited Seattle, right? I think that people should open their horizons, especially when it comes to something like the way cities are built, because there's a lot that can be learned from any city. Like every city does some things well and uniquely well, and so I think a big part of it is just trying to encourage people to become a little more familiar, because I think it leads to better conversations. I think that there's a lot of like we couldn't do that or that's not possible kind of talk in transportation or infrastructure or housing. And when you have great examples that you can just bring up and say, well, they do it in this place and this place, those are nobody says those places are miserable places to live. I think it's a very good way of kind of breaking through that lock that people get into.
Yeah, for sure. Was there kind of a moment where, what was kind of the light bulb moment you think that you really decide that you needed to do this, you needed to educate people? I'm kind of curious if there's some specific thing.
It wasn't necessarily an intent to educate people so much as, I was interested in the topic of public transportation. I had moved to Toronto, and I was getting, in moving to Toronto, I think I generally just got more curious about other places as well. And so I had learned a lot about different cities, and I'd met a lot of people from different cities. And so I thought, when I look back at the various forums that I used to frequent in Metro Vancouver about like urban development and transportation, I remember people saying things like, "Oh, like that's not possible. This is a problem we have. You can't. Oh, like Vancouver has earthquakes. Like subways, therefore must cost way more than they would cost in other countries. All kinds of stuff like that. And that's when you go, oh, yeah, like people need to hear from someone who's not, from within like 50 kilometers of them."
Yeah, makes sense. Mike, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I guess you kind of brought it up a little bit, and it's something that's been a little bit in the news here, and it's just in terms of the cost of building public transit, especially here in Vancouver. They announced the Skytrain extension is going to be $6 billion instead of $4 billion. So what have you seen in other cities around the world and how they develop their transit, but they don't spend all their money doing so, or they do so in a more financially sustainable way?
Well, the first thing that's, I think, important to note is that what Vancouver is building is not financially unsustainable, in the sense that there are many cities that are, building elevated metro lines that are comparable, if not higher capacity than the lines that they're building in Metro Vancouver. Obviously Broadway is underground, but even subways, and they're doing so for much lower prices, and they're still building them to the same, if not higher standards. And so, the cost explosion in Canada is largely downstream of, a privatization of what used to be a lot of state resources. So things like having planners and engineering consultants that works for the government instead of working entirely for private consortiums. Part of it is the fact that the construction market is overheated in Canada. There are transit projects being built in every major city, and sometimes multiple. And so that means that the resources are spread thin. And then it is a sort of overbuilding, overspecifying model. We have basically, in a place like Vancouver, we emulate like a city like Toronto or New York, because we assume that bigger cities must have kind of a better approach to big projects like this. And unfortunately, that's not the case. If you look at New York is the highest cost of building, subways of any city in the world. And if you look at a city like Paris, right? Paris is also historic, very dense, difficult ground conditions. Shouldn't really be much easier to build in Paris, and yet Paris built for like a fifth to a tenth the price of New York. And so really, these cost issues are not inherent to what's being constructed so much as the way we're going about doing it. And a big part of the problem is that there is no one who's just going, we need to build these projects, but we need to do it less expensively. It's always a debate of, should we cancel the project or should we build it? It's never about like, we can build projects, but we need to do it cost effectively. And I think that's quite fundamental.
Yeah, that's really interesting insight. It's kind of some of the same reading that I've seen, but it's interesting hearing from you, Simmer, because you studied it everywhere. Because basically, it's been a kind of a recent topic coming to Langley, and I'm not sure if you've seen it. 200 Street, for people watching that don't know Langley that well, 200 Street, like a 6-lane road that goes right down the middle from the freeway right down to the center of Langley. But in the last year, they've announced, hey, we're going to bring BRT to 200 Street, and there's going to be a lot of changes to the surrounding neighborhood. But BRT is something that's honestly brand new in Metro Vancouver. So I was wondering, Reece, like what systems around the world for BRT have you seen that you think might fit well into Langley and Metro Vancouver?
Yeah, so ultimately, BRT is a kind of ill-defined term. It doesn't have a real consistent meaning. The closest there is to a kind of consistent definition is there's an organization called the ITDP, which puts out a scorecard that basically allows you to assess the quality of quote unquote BRT or bus rapid transit infrastructure. And so it's a good thing to go off of. I think the more fundamental question is, should Langley build BRT? Is there another solution that makes more sense? I think growing up in Langley, the fundamental issue for Langley is not so much the speed of buses as the existence of them. I could be wrong, but at the moment, I'm not sure 200 Street even has an every 15-minute bus.
Doesn't, no.
Yeah.
You're right. And another one that I often bring up is the new neighborhood in Willoughby, the Yorks neighborhood in Willoughby, which doesn't even have any shuttle buses that go around. It's got one bus that goes. There's no way to get from east to west.
It's just that 208th Street. Right, and that's also 30 minutes. And so I think that on a fundamental level, Langley is falling into the same trap that many American cities fall into, which is that we have to do something flashy and sexy, in the form of BRT, which, many cities have done. Some have done successfully. But the fundamental issue is just there's not enough service, right? Like, I think Langley would be much better off investing in a high level of service frequency across a larger number of corridors than building, particularly nice infrastructure on 200th Street, which, as you kind of mentioned, is already kind of an inhospitable place. I almost think that like 208 is a more potentially friendly street, or one that's a little easier to make hospitable to humans. And so I think that the mistake is saying like we need this one corridor to have really high level of service. It's fine if it does, but I think it would be better to have 15-minute service on a couple streets before you talk about like 200th Street getting super high levels of infrastructure, et cetera. And I mean, this is all dependent on ridership as well. So if you run a 15-minute or a 10-minute, I would say 10-minute is typically preferable, because it means if buses get delayed, the minimum you'd wait would still be up roughly 15 minutes. I think you should roll that out on some major corridors, see what the ridership is like, and then you move forward from there. If the ridership is high, you increase the service level. Maybe you install some additional bus lanes and queue jumps where there's congestion, and you just kind of cycle. You just keep doing that until you get to a point where the ridership cannot be sustained with the infrastructure you have, and then you move on to a higher level of kind of infrastructure, and you could talk about different solutions. But I think there's a great Strong Towns article about Brampton, Ontario, that talks about something very similar, and I think that's the correct approach for a city like Langley.
I wanted to ask because it's kind of funny. I read your article, which is a few months ago, I think now, back in June, July, where you praised the Skytrain system. And I guess you could almost argue what you're saying is that it is a big flashy project in a sense. And the BRT, do you think maybe even, but you seem to be in favor of the Skytrain. So what do you think is the difference between like the benefit of the Skytrain versus the BRT in that sense?
Well, the difference, as I see it, is that Skytrain is expensive, but Skytrain delivers benefits commensurate with those expenses. Whereas with, bus rapid transit, the type that would be built in Langley, I'm not convinced it would actually improve speed all that much. Median busways, especially in North America, they sometimes slow service down more than they speed it up, because now what you've done is you've put the buses in a position where left-turning vehicles are going to, get in their way. They can't necessarily move from lane to lane easily, and so that means they can't get around disruptions as easily, which includes, turning traffic that's blocking them. You spent a ton of money. You have more infrastructure to maintain, and yet, there's no limit to, if you have some curbside bus lanes, you can run buses every 10 minutes or every 5 minutes. Toronto has very little bus lane, which is not a good thing about Toronto. But yet Toronto manages to run buses every 5 to 10 minutes on every major street. Any street like 200th in Toronto would have a bus that comes every 5 minutes. And so for me, if I'm thinking about the marginal dollar and where we're using it, it's much better to invest in service than in those bus lanes in the middle of the road. I think if you do bus lanes, it should be strategic. You only need them in places where there's congestion. If you look at a street like 200, that's near the intersections. It's rare that, congestion backs up all the way, to the middle of a block, right? So if you're strategic, your infrastructure dollars go further. And just by running service more frequently, you easily get the same amount of time savings. Because, when you talk about a transit journey, a big part of the time spent is just sitting, waiting. So if your frequency is much higher, if you go from 15 minutes to 5 minutes, you just save 10 minutes off the average rider's journey, right? And so I think that's a much more effective way to spend your resources. Skytrain is good because Skytrain, it allows for higher level of service than would be possible on a street, because you're building an entirely new dedicated right-of-way above the street. That means that trains aren't subject to traffic lights, which exists no matter what. In every country that does trams or light rail, you go to Portland, you can experience it. Seattle, same thing. So with Skytrain, we're spending a lot of money, but we're getting an enormous capacity and speed improvement for that money. And so that's why something like that I see as being valuable.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I really love that you're always something about Strong Towns, right? It's like making a large bet or a small bet. And the BRT is almost forcing a very large, perhaps oversized bet that's not, we haven't even started on just building up to get there. We haven't even started with the coverage improvements. We're just going BRT. So that's great from that perspective too. So that's really interesting. I mean, one thing I would want to also ask about the article you wrote is that you seem to think that Skytrain in particular is almost the perfect system for Vancouver, Metro Vancouver. And I'm curious why, if you could kind of explain why you think it's such a good system for this city in this region.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Skytrain would be a really good solution for any city in North America, or really any city of the future that isn't, built on a traditional development pattern that you would see from a city that, mostly grew in 100 years ago plus, when cars were not as widespread, right? And so what that leads to when you have a kind of more modern cities, you tend to have a lot of spikiness, right? You have lower density areas, and then you have higher density areas. And Skytrain is really good for going through those low density areas at a low cost, because you can be above ground, and then serving those high density areas with pretty, again, low cost infrastructure, stations that can be built, on a mall parking lot or something, as we're going to see in Langley. But as we've seen with previous Skytrain projects, those parking lots can be redeveloped. You can fill the high density in between. The service is fast, which is important because, even Metro Vancouver, which is actually not that sprawling compared to some cities in North America, the distances are large. And so you want to have high speed. And then it has really good frequency, both because it's got its own dedicated right of way, but also because it's automated. So there's not a cost trade-off to just running trains more frequently, or at least not a substantial one. You can run 2 short trains for the same price as you can run 1 long train. This is not a benefit that a city like Seattle or Portland has with their light rail systems, because they have drivers. So they have to kind of make the longest trains possible so that they can use their driver resources effectively. But transit is most effective when it's frequent. And so actually what you really want to do is have the highest possible frequency and only make the trains longer when you have more passengers than can fit on a smaller train. And so I think that's kind of, it's got every feature you'd want. It's not expensive if done correctly. If you look at old Skytrain projects, they weren't expensive, like the ones that we're talking about today. It's fast and it's frequent, and it integrates well with, improving land use over time, right? So it's kind of got everything you could want.
Mm-hmm.
Just speaking about land use around Skytrain, one of the changes the province did here, obviously, was mandate transit-oriented development. And then it is going to impact Langley at Willowbrook. But I was wondering, Reece, sort of, would you envision as, it would be a great way to use that land around Willowbrook? For people that don't know, it's kind of on a highway. There's a strobe, there's a parking lot, and then a big suburban mall right now. So there's a lot that can be done, but I was wondering sort of what did you think should be done with that land there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, ultimately, I think suburban malls get a bit of a bad rap. In Canada, there's not so many compared to America, where we didn't really overbuild them to the same extent, where, every city has 5 of them. And so they're all like, going defunct at once. They are effectively, like town centers for a lot of communities. And so what Willowbrook offers is a real opportunity. They're obviously slowly redeveloping it and making it slightly nicer. I would suggest that, when that redevelopment is going on and they're, putting new businesses in, et cetera, there should be, I know that there, and this is literally only because I grew up in Langley, there was like a Safeway next to Willowbrook Mall for the longest time.
Yeah.
I think it's still there. That's a good amenity. Like if they want to redevelop that land into a slightly denser mall adjacent property, they should be required to keep a grocery store there, because having a grocery store is really important to, making community livable. If you just encircle Willowbrook Mall, redevelop its parking lots, put towers there, obviously with higher density adjacent to the Skytrain and tapering down as you move away from the Skytrain, as sort of makes sense economically, then, you create a little 15-minute community there, right? People can walk within the giant mega block that is Willowbrook Mall and kind of the stuff east to 200th Street. You want to keep that grocery store in there. And then that means a lot of people's daily, errands and stuff can be accomplished there. The mall not being like a Pacific Center type mall, like a top tier mall, means that it actually has a lot of services that can be useful, dentist, etc. And so it actually provides a lot of amenity to the community. If you have additional density, it's obviously great for the mall as well. It means additional customers. And so I think, start planning something like that so that it becomes more pedestrian friendly. It's surrounded by high density. Calm the internal streets so that they're not, terrible places. Right now, they are in a lot of places. There's giant intersections between these different driveways and stuff. A little redesign and beautification could make them into kind of like gentle neighborhood streets. And in doing all that stuff, you would basically turn that entire block into a walkable, nice community. Fraser Highway, you got to just slowly wear away at that. Probably add transit lanes, add, cycle tracks, slowly reduce the speed limit of it, push people onto the actual expressways that exist in the region instead of, Fraser Highway, the Langley bypass, I guess is what I'm thinking of. And that's kind of what I would suggest in a place like that, the same kind of model that you see in places like Metrotown, but like, let's try to make it a more coherent plan and make sure all of the key amenities remain for future residents so they don't need to drive.
Yeah, I think just to elaborate on your point about the wide roads and also Mike's question originally, is I think there's some concern that what could happen is what we've kind of seen happen around Brentwood in Burnaby, which is that you've got a Skytrain station, you've got these towers going up, but unfortunately Lougheed Highway is still right there, and it makes and as well as Wellington, and it makes the area quite hostile to pedestrians, even though it's got this sort of rapid transit connection. So I guess is there some kind of secret to making sure that doesn't happen? Like, what have you observed? Like, what have you observed in other places to kind of resolve those kind of issues, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think that there is no secret. There's no free lunch. Like, ultimately, this is the Langley bypass is a terrible street. It's worse than Lougheed Highway. It barely has sidewalks in most places, right? Like, if they can be called sidewalks where they do exist, there's no free lunch. I think ultimately that's why I suggest like the Skytrain station is going to be on the corner of the Willowbrook Mall property. You can at least make it so that anyone within that block doesn't have to cross a major street, and that could be a lot of people with redevelopment. And then you want to slowly go and improve the pedestrian crossings in up those major streets, and you want to have great bus connections because ultimately those streets are going to be bad for a pretty long time, most likely. So you want to say, okay, how can we utilize them today? And that means, good bus service. There's lots of room for buses on those giant streets. And yeah, adding stuff like cycle tracks and at least decent pedestrian facilities, even if it's only on one side of the street, so that people can at least travel along them safely and, semi-comfortably. Put up Jersey barriers and stuff so that there's no concern that cars are going to fly into the bike lane. And I think that's the best you can do without seriously just completely redesigning the street, right? And that's something that it's going to be very hard to do overnight because you'd hope eventually a lot of the big box stores that are fronting like the Langley bypass get redeveloped. But even when that's happening, there might be pressure not to redesign the street because you have all the construction vehicles coming in and out, right? And that's something that we see in Toronto a lot, is that street redesign is often the last thing to happen, because why would you rebuild a street and make it really nice and then have it like destroyed by, cranes and dump trucks driving over it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're right, absolutely right, that we have to do it properly. I think there's just some concern we don't have. Right now there was a Willowbrook plan in process, but that got paused because the staff resources of the township of Langley could focus on the 200 Street plan instead. And so now we got the province saying we want the density, so there's a risk of density with no plans. So there's some concern there. We'll see. Hopefully we can get some of the improvements you mentioned in first. Another question, I guess, a little bit out of left field perhaps, is land lift. Is that when you put the Skytrain station in, it's very beneficial to landowners. How much do you think we should be concerned about capturing the land lift from stations, or what could our approach be, the most effective approach be for that aspect of when we put in a station?
I think it's difficult. I think that there is, frankly, you can do additional taxes, etc., but that runs the risk of stifling development, which, especially with regard to housing, I'm not sure that's going to be a popular approach and maybe not an effective approach. I really think that if we want to unlock a lot of money, we should work to fix our cost problem on building this infrastructure in the first place, because it's going to be very hard to extract $3 billion in land lift over the next, over the short term on the kind of Surrey-Langley corridor. A lot of development will happen, and there will be a lot of, it will be much more than $3 billion worth of development, but actually extracting that much in public return, I think, will be a challenge. But extracting $3 billion of return from just making the Skytrain cost half as much next time we build it, or maybe even getting the cost of this project to be lower, that's something that's actually very imminently doable. Like, if you look at the Canada line, right, it was 19 kilometers. So it was slightly longer than Surrey-Langley Skytrain. Much of it was in tunnel, and it cost half as much. Now, obviously, there has been inflation, but inflation has not doubled the price of everything since 2010, right? And so I think that that's actually the most effective place to focus our energies. And, Translink is doing stuff like starting to do its own developments and the like. And so I think that's where we'll probably try to capture a lot of the value of the land, the value increase of the land in Metro Vancouver. I think that it's very hard for like the township of Langley to competently do that. It's a lot to bite off, and I'm just not sure it's the most effective use of the township's resources to try to do that. I think it would be better to try to support Translink's efforts instead, like maybe try to unlock some land that they can do their own developments on, so that the transit authority has more funding to go build more transit.
One of the big things that people mention online, especially like people that live in Murrayville or Aldergrove, which are more strong neighborhoods in Langley, it's great. I'd say it's coming, but I need a parkade right there in order to use it. So I was just wondering, Reece, what's your view on Park and Ride? Is that a good use of land?
Well, I mean, I think that next to Skytrain, no, it's not a good use of land. Yeah. Absolutely not. That has been something that systems like BART in the Bay Area and the Washington Metro and DC have done a lot of that. And, they're like significantly more poorly used per kilometer than Skytrain is, because, parking spot, as much as it does provide access to people, ultimately, even if you build a massive parkade with 2,000 spots, that's going to fill up like 3 or 4 trains, right? And Skytrain can run at max like 40 trains per hour, right? So you're just never going to be able to support the transit system that way. You might be able to give people an easier way to get to the transit system, and so you can include some spots in adjacent developments. They shouldn't be free, obviously, so they should kind of have to pay for themselves over the length of those spots. And so you can have a few for sure, but I think it's much more valuable to just encourage people to use connecting transit, right? The connecting transit needs to be massively improved with the Surrey Langley Skytrain. Like, it sort of makes sense right now that Murrayville and Aldergrove don't have great transit to like Surrey Central, because that's a very significant distance away. It's in a different municipality, right? But when Skytrain extends to the center of Langley, Murrayville is very short distance. It's cycling distance from the Skytrain. So it should certainly have like a couple very frequent bus routes going to it. And Aldergrove should have like an express bus that runs every 10 minutes or something like that to the center of Aldergrove to the Skytrain. Like, that is the best way of connecting folks to the Skytrain. And if the idea is that, I'm not going to ride a bus, people in White Rock ride the bus to the Canada Line. People have like all different income levels. People in Walnut Grove ride the bus to Loki, on the highway, the 555. And so I'm just not a believer that if the service is good, people wouldn't use it. I think that that's the most cost-effective way, and the way that kind of leads to Langley developing in the best way, and not turning the super valuable land next to the new stations, which Langley is only getting 2 of, into more parking, right?
Definitely. Perfect.
By most of the West Coast Express stations, like the one in Maple Ridge, I don't know how familiar you are, it is just a parking lot. It's not housing. So maybe we could improve the land use there. And also, like, how do you think the West Coast Express is something we should also look at improving? And like, how could we approach that? Because I think there's some capacity limitations with the track and sharing with freight. Like, is there any approach we could have there to maybe improve that service?
Yeah, I think the West Coast Express it could be improved. I think it is challenging because the cost to improve it is going to be pretty high, because it is, yes, using freight railroad tracks that are not owned by Translink, and so you have to invest in building additional track to kind of make a negotiation with those freight railroads that you should be able to run more trains. And so that's something that can happen, and over time it may make sense to to spend more and more on it. But where I really think the value is for something like that is, like, look at Highway 1, right? The 555 bus is super heavily used. It's very popular. It's fast. It's efficient. And so I think that if we're talking about like commuter type service, like extending that service, or doing additional services, the 556 that goes to Aldergrove, right? And having a park and ride there along the highway, like, that's, it's a more reasonable use of land, because land near highways is unfortunately kind of blighted, right? Like, it's a highway, it's terrible for the environment, and it creates really low air quality. And so that is a place where, putting some parking is not the worst idea in the world. You have like Carvolth Exchange and Walnut Grove. Doing something like that at a few other highway exits, one near Trinity Western, probably one out in Aldergrove, and then make that your park and ride location. Keep the space compact. Like, if you look at the parking at Carvolth, it's not a giant parking lot, certainly not the size of the parking lots at Willowbrook Mall. And then you can say, if it gets super busy eventually, that's a place you can build a parking structure there. It doesn't have to take up a ton of land, and then you can have still, as you're seeing in North Langley, high density development in the surrounding area. But I think for kind of commuter use, that's the most effective way of us spending resources. The West Coast Express, as much as I would like it to be like a very frequent service like the GO trains in Toronto, it's just very challenging because it is such a highly constrained rail line. It runs next to the Fraser, runs next to the Burrard Inlet. It's got a ton of freight traffic because it's going to the Port of Vancouver. And so that's where I see the commuter transit situation being.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think they are actually might be looking into doing something at the Gloucester Estates like a bus terminal there? Because there's no transit out there either, and that's been a contentious point for a while, that people basically have to drive to Gloucester Estates to get to all the various commercial and industrial jobs. And that's another interesting point too, is the relationship between getting transit service. It's almost like a chicken and egg. Do you get the transit first, or do you have to build the area up to attract the transit service there first? Like, how do you see that kind of balance, like in terms of, do you need the density to lure the transit? Do you have to make the transit to force the density? Like, what are your thoughts on that kind of area as well?
I think that ultimately, if you want a neighborhood to be very successful with public transit, you need the transit to be there from day one, and you have to sort of run it at a loss, so to speak, or at a more extreme loss for a while before people kind of build their habits around it. If the transit doesn't exist from day one, especially in a kind of suburban Langley, people are just not very likely to use it because they're going to build a habit around driving. And even if the transit does, exist after the fact, it's probably not going to be time competitive with driving, and people are going to be used to driving. They're already going to have the car. It's very unlikely you're going to drive a significant mode shift. So, if you want a large number of people to access a location by transit, you need to have the transit as early as possible. And of course, these things can change over time, but you're just fighting an uphill battle where in a place like Langley, where you're developing entirely new areas, you really shouldn't have to. You should really plan around it from the beginning. You should try to put employment in your existing transit corridors where possible, right? So that you don't have that problem.
Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to talk about, Reece, though, or?
Yeah.
No, I mean, not particularly. I think it's very exciting that Skytrain is coming to Langley. I think that really the most important thing that the city and township can do is run more bus service, right? Like, I think that any transportation solution that doesn't involve that as a significant component of it is just not likely to be super successful. The land use is not great in a lot of Langley. The uses are not well blended, and so people are going to have to travel to get to a lot of their destinations. That's kind of locked in. That can change slowly over time. But in the meantime, like providing a good basic level of transit service, determining some key corridors. And yes, those are the corridors where you should intensify along. So like, your 208th and 200th Street, and maybe a north-south route in the south, and in the north, try to create a kind of coherent grid that feeds into the Skytrain. And I think that's the way you've kind of got to develop. And at the margins, trying to do things like make sure new streets have cycle tracks on them, make sure developments have, less parking, more space for bikes, stuff like that, I think is very important. It's lower speed limits, bus lanes when you can, Translink has this money that they disperse to municipalities to build like bus priority infrastructure. I wouldn't say Langley's a place they should spend that money because Langley doesn't have frequent bus service. But if it did, then you could say, hey, like Translink, give us a bunch of money. It's money that we all pay for in our taxes. Like, why not use some of it to make the transit service better, right? Enhance the transit stops. Like, a lot of them don't have shelters, right? That's a pretty miserable experience. So I think there's the kind of key focuses, which are just better service and kind of like, the key land use things. And then there's just like marginal improvement across the board, transportation-wise.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap it. Maybe one more I was thinking when you were talking just then is the relationship between like municipalities and Translink in accomplishing the goal you just talked about. Do you think the way that it works right now is the most effective way? Are there other places in the world where you see they have a different working relationship that maybe works better?
I think today's system's pretty good, to be honest. Translink is, it is to some extent, it should be more the kind of, the ultimate goal, like a regionally integrated transit authority.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there's always going to be like local democracies that are going to get in the way of things. And so I think where there's a big opportunity for a place like Langley, right, is people in Metro Vancouver have so many municipalities they could live in. If you become a place where transit is good because the city is supportive of good transit, right, that can be a serious positive reason to be in Langley, right? Like compare the transit service in Vancouver to Surrey. Part of it is because Translink literally just runs more service in Vancouver, but Vancouver also has, more priority infrastructure, land use that's more supportive of the transit. There's all of these other things. And so it's kind of it's a two-way street. Translink will run service, but if you create a city that's more conducive to higher ridership, Translink's going to run more service in your city. And so the city should be doing whatever it can to make Langley a very livable place, a place that's easy to get around. And frankly, better transit makes it easier to get around by car as well. So I think what you're really wanting to do is, hey, the region has all of these municipalities. Why don't we make Langley a very attractive place to be by making its transit good? There's challenges, but there's also opportunities. And I think that's where, there's a real opportunity for people to also get involved and say, like, Langley is not that big and it's growing quite quickly. So there's a huge potential for positive change. And people, because it's small, it's very easy for people to have an impact and to get involved, right? It's not like Vancouver or Surrey, where it's kind of a super tanker, and turning it requires a lot of effort, right? A lot can be accomplished by a few people. And if Langley becomes a very attractive place to be, it can be like one of those small communities in the United States that people want to move to because, it has like a lot of bike paths and it has uniquely good transit. All of that stuff is possible in Langley if people kind of, have their eyes on that.
Yeah, I think all of us are aligned on that. We would love to see Langley go that route, become a transit-friendly place. People are into place, and with the cycling infrastructure, and that's exactly what our group is fighting for as well. And yeah, I appreciate your insights on that, Reece, and thank you for your time today. I guess one final question: like, what's next for RMTransit? What's the next? Is there any big projects in the pipeline that we should be looking forward to?
I'm always working on new stuff. Covering more cities, different places. I'm very interested in China now because I've covered a lot of the world that isn't inside China, and so I've been focused on China quite a lot. No, it's just kind of more of the same, like promoting better public transportation and trying to deal with these issues of housing. Obviously, it's a massive crisis across the country, but also infrastructure costs. Like, I think that's a huge thing that we have to be focused on.
I'd love to. Yeah,
we subsidize a lot of stuff through infrastructure building, and we kind of do a lot of handouts too, like, business doesn't like that Skytrain is going in, we're going to pay to relocate them, or this or that. Community wants us to build a new park that is only tenuously related to the Skytrain project. That sort of stuff slows down infrastructure, makes it more expensive to build, and it means we have less of it. So I think it's really about trying to make sure that we are efficient at, building the transit, the sewers, the roads and everything, because that way we can get more of that stuff built and we can only accelerate the pace of change in a place like Langley.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today, Reece. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And I learned a lot. So thank you. And hope we'll stay in touch. If you ever cover Langley, feel free to reach out to us again.
Yeah, thank you.